There are towns on old maps that don't exist anymore. Not because they were abandoned. Not because they burned down. Because someone decided they needed to disappear. The people were gone by morning. The buildings came down within weeks. And the paperwork? Classified for decades. By the end of this, you're going to know the names of towns that your government pretended never existed. You'll know why entire communities were wiped from official records overnight, and more disturbingly, you'll understand exactly how they got away with it for so long. Let's start with something that should bother you. Open any American road atlas from 1940. Flip to the state of Tennessee. You'll find a cluster of small rural communities: Wheat, Elza, Robertsville, Scarborough. Farming towns. Families. Churches. Roughly 1,000 people living quiet lives on land their grandparents had cleared. By late 1942, they were gone. The government sent agents door to door. Not soldiers. Men in suits, carrying envelopes. Inside each envelope was a notice. You have a few weeks. Sometimes less. The price of your land has already been decided. You will be compensated. You cannot negotiate. You cannot refuse. Pack what you can carry and leave the rest. One woman who was 17 years old at the time described it this way decades later. She said, "We didn't know what was happening. Nobody told us anything. We just knew we had to go." Within months, a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire sealed off more than 59,000 acres. Guard towers went up. Armed checkpoints appeared on roads that used to lead to neighbors' houses. The entire area was reclassified. Given a new name. A name designed to sound like nothing at all. They called it Oak Ridge. And what they built inside that fence would change the history of the entire planet. Oak Ridge became one of the 3 primary sites of the Manhattan Project, the secret American program to build the world's first atomic bomb. Tens of thousands of workers flooded in, but they worked in compartmentalized silence. Most of them had no idea what they were making. They were told only what they needed to know to do their specific task. The full picture was withheld even from the people building it. The original residents? Scattered. Some relocated to nearby counties. Some never recovered financially. Many died before the full story was ever declassified. And the communities they built, the churches, the schools, the cemeteries, some of those cemeteries were moved. Others were not. But Oak Ridge, as shocking as it is not even the most extreme case. Because at least Oak Ridge eventually became public knowledge. There are other towns that almost didn't. Now cross the ocean. And understand that this wasn't just an American phenomenon. Because while the U.S. government was sealing off Tennessee farmland, the Soviet Union was doing something that made Oak Ridge look almost transparent by comparison. Starting in the late 1940s, the Soviet state began constructing what became known as closed cities. These weren't just restricted zones. They were fully functioning urban centers, with apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, factories, sports stadiums, that did not appear on any publicly available map. Anywhere. Ever. You could live in one of these cities your entire life and technically not exist according to Soviet records. Your mail had a code number instead of a location. Your address was a P.O. box in a city that wasn't yours. If you wrote home to your family, the envelope told them nothing about where you actually were. At peak count, the Soviet Union had over 40 of these closed cities. Combined population, over 1 million people. Living in places that, officially, did not exist. The most chilling example is Chelyabinsk, 65. Today it's known as Ozyorsk. For decades it was a blank space on Soviet maps, a void where land simply had no label. Inside that void was a city of nearly 100,000 people, all of them workers at the Mayak nuclear facility, one of the most dangerous production sites in human history. In 1957, Mayak suffered a catastrophic nuclear explosion, later classified as the third worst nuclear disaster ever recorded. The surrounding area was irradiated. Tens of thousands of people in nearby villages were evacuated. Their villages were bulldozed. The rivers were contaminated. And the Soviet government said nothing. To its own people. To the world. To anyone. The explosion at Mayak was not publicly acknowledged by Soviet authorities until 1989. 32 years of silence. The evacuated villages don't appear on Soviet-era maps. The people who were displaced received no official explanation for years. Some were told simply that the area had become unsuitable for habitation. That was it. No cause given. Think about what that means. You grew up in a place. You raised children there. And then men arrive, tell you to leave, and your home is bulldozed before you reach the next town. And no one will ever tell you why. And the place you came from is removed from every map that anyone will ever be allowed to see. That is not an accident. That is architecture. Deliberate, calculated erasure. Now here's where it gets stranger. Because the towns we've talked about so far, Oak Ridge, the Soviet-closed cities, the Mayak villages, these all have one thing in common. They disappeared because of what governments were building. But there is a category of erased towns with a completely different origin. These towns didn't disappear because something was being constructed. They disappeared because of what had already gone wrong. And the cover-up in these cases wasn't about protecting a weapons program. It was about protecting something far more personal to the people in power. It was about protecting reputation. Before we get to those cases, you need to understand something even stranger about how erasure actually works. Because it isn't just about demolishing buildings or redrawing maps. The most effective erasure happens in a place that's much harder to reach. It happens in memory. And there is a specific, documented method that governments have used, repeatedly, to ensure that the people who lived through these events would eventually stop talking about them. Not through threats. Not through force. Through something far more insidious. In the years following World War II, a study was conducted by American psychologists working under government contracts examining how survivor communities, groups of people displaced from the same location, how they processed and retained collective memory over time. The findings were quietly alarming. When displaced communities were kept together, their shared memory remained vivid and detailed across generations. They built informal memorials. They kept records. They told their children. They demanded answers. But when those same communities were deliberately scattered, relocated to different counties, different states, something predictable happened. Without each other, the memory degraded. Not disappeared. But fractured. Isolated individuals without community reinforcement will, over a generation, begin to doubt their own recollections. They become reluctant to speak. They begin to wonder if they're misremembering. They go quiet. And so deliberate scattering became policy. Oak Ridge's original residents were not relocated together. They were spread across the region individually. The closed city workers in the Soviet Union were forbidden from communicating their location to family members. The villages evacuated around Mayak were dispersed across multiple districts, their former neighbors now strangers in different towns. This is the hidden mechanism. This is the part that never makes it into the history books. Because demolishing buildings leaves rubble. Redrawing maps leaves old maps. But fracturing a community leaves almost nothing. A handful of elderly people in different counties, each one half convinced they've somehow gotten the details wrong. That is how you erase a town completely. Not with bulldozers. With distance. With silence. With time. The scattering policy worked for decades. But not forever. Because paper trails, unlike people, don't forget. In the 1990s, a series of declassification orders under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act began releasing documents that researchers had been requesting since the 1970s. Among those documents were survey records, land acquisition orders, and internal memos referencing communities that had been removed. And what those documents revealed went beyond Oak Ridge. There was Piqua, Ohio, a community displaced for a nuclear reactor project, the residents given 60 days and told the area was needed for federal industrial purposes. No further explanation. The reactor, an experimental sodium-cooled design, later experienced a partial meltdown in 1966. It was quietly decommissioned. The land was never returned. There was Patuxent Village in Maryland, a community of African American landowners, many of them descendants of freedmen who had purchased their land after the Civil War. The land was seized through eminent domain in the 1940s for a naval air station. The residents were relocated. The village ceased to exist. It took until 2019 for a formal historical acknowledgement to even be pursued. In Britain, the entire village of Imber on Salisbury Plain was evacuated in 1943. Residents were told they would return after the war. The army needed the village for combat training exercises. They practiced street fighting in the houses. They practiced demolitions in the fields. The war ended. The people were not allowed back. Imber is still uninhabited. The army still controls it. Residents and their descendants are allowed in, 2 days per year. 2 days. To visit the place they were born. The place their parents are buried. Here is the thing that should stay with you after this video ends. Every single one of these cases followed the same pattern. Emergency justification. Dispersal of the population. Removal from maps and records. Decades of official silence. And then, only when researchers, journalists, or the displaced communities themselves refused to go quiet, a slow, grudging, partial acknowledgement. Never a full apology. Rarely full compensation. Almost never a complete accounting of what happened and why. These weren't rogue operations. They were policy. Approved at the highest levels. Carried out by ordinary people following orders, filling out forms, processing land deeds, redirecting mail. The machinery of erasure doesn't require monsters. It requires bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is very good at losing things. The towns are still gone. Most of the people who lived in them are gone now too. But the foundations are still there under the fields. The old road beds are still there under the grass. The maps with the crossed-out names are still there, in the archives. If you know where to look. The record was never fully erased. It was just buried deep enough that most people stopped digging. You just dug a little deeper. If this broke something open for you, subscribe. We put out one of these every single week. And next time, we're going inside the government program that didn't just erase towns. It erased the people who lived in them. Their names. Their histories. Their identities. Replaced entirely. Some of them never knew who they actually were. That story is coming. Don't miss it.